Lucy Beth was cleaning a billionaire's office when she saw something that made her blood freeze. A portrait of her father, the man who supposedly died in a factory fire 20 years ago, standing right next to Richard Hale. When she burst into the dining room and demanded answers in front of his business associates, the 67-year-old millionaire's face drained of all color, his hands started trembling, and in that moment Lucy wasn't so certain, but she felt her father's death had more to it, and this man knew exactly what happened to him. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now back to the story. The sterling didn't just look expensive, it breathed wealth from every crystal chandelier and marble column, a temple where millionaires came to feast on their success and forget the people they'd stepped on to get there. Lucy Beth moved between tables like a ghost, her black uniform pressed to perfection, her practiced smile concealing the bone-deep exhaustion of working 16 hours straight. She'd mastered the art of disappearing, of becoming invisible to people who never bothered looking at the hands that filled their glasses or cleared their plates. Tonight, the restaurant's private dining hall buzzed with even more energy than usual, and Lucy learned that Richard Hale himself, the tech millionaire who owned half the city, was hosting an exclusive dinner upstairs. She'd heard his name whispered with equal parts admiration and fear her entire life, though she'd never laid eyes on him in person. When the head server barked, "Beth, you're on executive office detail. Mr. Hale needs the space prepared before his meeting." Lucy swallowed her nervousness and grabbed her cleaning supplies. The private office gleamed with understated power. Mahogany furniture polished to a mirror shine, crystal decanters arranged precisely on a bar cart, and one entire wall lined with framed photographs documenting decades of success. Lucy worked methodically, wiping down the glass desk and humming softly under her breath, when something on that wall made her freeze mid-motion. Behind the desk hung a large portrait of two men standing shoulder to shoulder in what looked like a workshop or laboratory. The younger man was unmistakably Richard Hale, though his hair was darker and his face less hardened by time. The other man, wearing work coveralls and safety glasses, had kind eyes and a crooked smile that made Lucy's cleaning cloth slip from her trembling fingers. It was her father, Jack Lawson, the man whose funeral she'd attended when she was 5 years old after he died in a factory fire. She stepped closer until her reflection wavered in the glass covering the portrait, her breath fogging the surface. Her father wore the same wristwatch she kept in a jewelry box at home, the one her mother said was recovered from the accident site. Blueprints were spread across the table between the two men, and they stood like equals, like partners celebrating something important. Why was her father in Richard Hale's office, displayed like a trophy on the wall of a man who'd never mentioned knowing him? Her pulse hammered so loudly in her ears that she barely heard the door open behind her. Richard Hale walked in mid-conversation with a group of men in expensive suits, his commanding presence filling every corner of the room, his laughter sharp and calculated. He stopped abruptly when he saw her standing near the portrait, and their eyes met, hers wide with shock and disbelief, his narrowing with confusion and something else she couldn't quite name. Lucy's lips parted before she could stop herself, before common sense or self-preservation could intervene. "Sir," she said, her voice shaking despite her attempt to steady it, "why is my father in your office?" The entire room froze as if someone had pressed pause on reality. Conversations died mid-sentence. Wine glasses stopped halfway to lips, and every face turned toward her. Richard Hale's expression shifted from mild annoyance to something hollow and colorless. Fear. For one terrifying moment, the titan of industry who commanded boardrooms and bent city officials to his will looked like a man stripped naked and exposed. His voice came out barely above a whisper, cracking at the edges. "What did you say?" Lucy's throat felt tight, but she forced the words out anyway. "My father," she repeated, pointing at the portrait with a trembling hand. "Jack Lawson, that's him standing next to you." Color drained from Richard Hale's face like water from a broken dam. His hand began to shake visibly before he shoved it deep into his pocket, and the business associates exchanged uncomfortable glances, suddenly very interested in the floor. The billionaire who never lost control, who'd built an empire on steel nerves and ruthless decisions, suddenly looked like he'd seen a ghost walk through his carefully constructed walls. If you were Lucy, would you confront him right there or walk away and pretend you'd seen nothing? Tell me what you'd do in the comments. And in that silent, breathless moment, with every eye in the room watching the impossible unfold, Lucy knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't just coincidence. This man knew exactly who her father was, and judging by the terror written across his face, he knew exactly what had happened to him. The silence stretched like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap at any second. One of the business associates coughed awkwardly, mumbling something about needing fresh air, and Richard waved a dismissive hand without taking his eyes off Lucy. "Gentlemen, if you'll excuse us for a moment, I'll join you downstairs shortly," he said, his voice regaining a fraction of its usual authority. They fled gratefully, eager to escape the suffocating tension. Once the door clicked shut, Richard's composure cracked further. "You're mistaken, miss," he began, but Lucy cut him off. "Beth." "Lucy Beth," she said, finding strength in her anger. "And I'm not mistaken. That's my father, the man who supposedly died in a factory fire 20 years ago, so why is he hanging on your wall like some kind of trophy?" Richard's jaw tightened, and something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, guilt, maybe both. "You need to leave," he said quietly, but the command lacked conviction. "This is private property, and you're making wild accusations you don't understand." "Then help me understand," Lucy shot back, her voice rising. "You knew him, didn't you? You knew Jack Lawson." For a long moment, Richard said nothing, just stared at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "You should leave this alone," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "Some truths are better left buried." Before Lucy could respond, the office door opened again, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside. Marcus, Hale's head of security, whose cold eyes swept over Lucy like she was an insect that needed removing. "Miss Beth, I'll need you to come with me," he said in a tone that wasn't quite a request. Lucy glanced back at the portrait one last time, memorizing every detail, then pulled out her phone and snapped a quick photo before Marcus could stop her. "I'm not done asking questions," she said, meeting Richard Hale's eyes directly. Marcus's hand closed around her arm, not quite painful but absolutely firm. "You are now," he said, guiding her toward the door. "And Miss Beth, if I were you, I'd forget everything I saw here tonight, for your own sake." As she was escorted through the kitchen and out the staff entrance into the cold night air, Lucy heard the words she'd been dreading. "You're terminated, effective immediately," Marcus said flatly. "Don't come back." The door slammed behind her, leaving Lucy standing alone in the alley with nothing but her phone, a blurry photograph, and more questions than she'd ever had in her life. She looked at the image on her screen, her father's face smiling next to the man who'd just had her thrown out, and felt something harden in her chest. Whatever Richard Hale was hiding, whatever had really happened to Jack Lawson 20 years ago, she was going to find out. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind and started walking toward the bus stop, her mind already racing through everything she knew and everything she needed to discover. Somewhere in this city there were answers, and now that she'd seen that portrait, she couldn't stop searching until she found them. The bus ride home felt longer than usual, every stop dragging on while Lucy stared at the photograph on her phone, memorizing every detail. Her father's crooked smile, the way he stood shoulder to shoulder with Richard Hale like they were equals, like they were friends. By the time she climbed the stairs to her mother's apartment, the anger had settled into something harder and colder in her chest, something that wouldn't let her rest until she had answers. Ellen Beth was watching television in the living room when Lucy burst through the door, still wearing her work uniform, her face flushed from the cold and something else entirely. "Lucy, what are you doing home so early?" her mother asked, her smile fading the moment she saw her daughter's expression. "Did something happen at work?" Lucy didn't answer, just walked straight to where her mother sat and held up her phone, the photograph filling the small screen. "I need you to tell me why Dad is in a picture with Richard Hale," she said, her voice shaking despite her attempt to stay calm. "And I need you to tell me the truth this time." The color drained from Ellen's face so fast it looked like someone had flipped a switch, and her hand flew to her mouth as if to trap the words trying to escape. For a long moment she just stared at the screen, her eyes filling with tears that spilled over and ran down her cheeks in silent tracks. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice breaking on every syllable. "From Richard Hale's office," Lucy said, sitting down on the coffee table directly in front of her mother so she couldn't look away. "It was hanging on his wall like some kind of trophy, and when I asked him about it, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Mom, he knew Dad, didn't he? They worked together, and you've been lying to me about it my entire life." Ellen's hands began to tremble, and she pressed them together in her lap as if she could physically hold herself together through sheer force of will. "You don't understand," she began, but Lucy cut her off. "Then make me understand," Lucy shot back, her voice rising. "You told me Dad died in a factory fire, that it was an accident, that we should be grateful the company gave us anything at all. But that picture tells a different story, doesn't it?" Ellen closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, something in her expression had shifted, like a dam finally breaking after holding back water for too long. "Your father didn't die in an accident," she said quietly, the words tumbling out in a rush as if she'd been holding them prisoner for 20 years. "He disappeared after a confrontation with Richard Hale, and I've spent every day since then wondering if I did the right thing by staying silent." Lucy felt the room tilt slightly, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean, disappeared?" Ellen wiped her eyes and took a shuddering breath, steadying herself before continuing. "Your father and Richard were partners, engineering partners who built something incredible together," she explained, her voice gaining strength as the truth finally found its way out. "They developed revolutionary clean energy technology called the Phoenix system, something that could have changed everything by providing affordable power to communities that needed it most." "Then what happened?" Lucy asked, though part of her already knew the answer wouldn't be good. "Richard betrayed him," Ellen said simply, her voice hardening with old anger that had never quite faded. "He secretly negotiated to sell the Phoenix system to a defense contractor who wanted to weaponize the technology, turn something beautiful into something destructive, and when your father found out, he threatened to expose Richard and cancel the whole deal." Lucy's mind raced, connecting pieces that had never made sense before. Her mother's fear of wealthy people, the way she'd always insisted they keep their heads down and never ask too many questions, the settlement money that had kept them afloat but never quite felt right. "What happened the night he disappeared?" she asked. "They had a confrontation at their research facility," Ellen said, her voice barely above a whisper now, as if speaking too loudly might summon old ghosts. "Jack went there to convince Richard to do the right thing, to honor their original vision. But he never came home, and 3 days later, the police told me there'd been a factory fire and your father's body had been recovered." "But you didn't believe them," Lucy said, understanding dawning cold and clear. Ellen shook her head slowly, fresh tears streaming down her face. "I wanted to, God knows I tried to believe the official story because the alternative was too horrible to consider. But Richard came to see me days after the funeral, and I knew then that something was terribly wrong." "He threatened you," Lucy said, "and it wasn't a question. He brought lawyers and security people with him, men in expensive suits who made it very clear what would happen if I ever spoke about the partnership or questioned the official story," Ellen confirmed, her voice flat with remembered fear. "He said he'd destroy us financially and legally, that I'd lose everything including you if I didn't sign the non-disclosure agreements and take the settlement money. And you were 5 years old, Lucy, just a baby who'd already lost her father, and I couldn't risk losing you too." Lucy felt anger and understanding war inside her chest, because how could she blame her mother for protecting her when she'd been just a child, powerless against men with money and lawyers and threats? "So you stayed silent," she said softly. "For 20 years, Ellen whispered, reaching out to cup Lucy's face with both hands. "And I've hated myself for it every single day, wondering if your father would be ashamed of me for giving up, for letting Richard Hale win." Lucy covered her mother's hands with her own, squeezing gently. "Did Dad leave anything behind, any evidence of what they were working on?" Ellen's eyes widened slightly, and she stood abruptly, walking to her bedroom with Lucy following close behind. She pulled an old shoebox from the top shelf of her closet, dust covering the lid like it hadn't been touched in years, and carried it back to the living room with trembling hands. "I kept everything I could," she said, setting the box on the coffee table and lifting the lid. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings about the factory fire, partnership agreements with both their fathers' signatures, photographs of Jack and Richard during happier times, and thick folders of technical documents Lucy didn't fully understand. But what caught her attention was a single key attached to a paper tag, the ink faded but still readable: Phoenix Storage, Unit 247. "What is this?" Lucy asked, picking up the key carefully. "Your father gave that to me 3 weeks before he disappeared," Ellen said, her voice barely audible. "He said if anything ever happened to him, I should keep it safe because it contained everything Richard couldn't be allowed to destroy. I was too afraid to use it, too afraid of what Richard might do if he found out, but maybe that was the wrong choice." Lucy closed her fingers around the key, feeling its weight settle into her palm like a promise. "I'm going to that storage unit," she said, meeting her mother's frightened eyes with determination. "Whatever Dad wanted protected, whatever evidence he left behind, I'm going to find it and finish what he started." "Lucy, no," Ellen pleaded, grabbing her daughter's arm. "Richard Hale is dangerous. He has money and power and people who'll do whatever he asks. If you go digging into this, he'll come after you the same way he came after your father." "Then let him come," Lucy said quietly, tucking the key into her pocket. "I'm not a scared little girl anymore, and I'm done letting him get away with whatever he did to Dad. One way or another, I'm going to find the truth." Ellen's face crumpled, but she didn't argue further, just pulled Lucy into a fierce embrace and held on like she was afraid to let go. "Promise me you'll be careful," she whispered against Lucy's hair. "Promise me you won't let him take you from me too." "I promise," Lucy said, though she wasn't entirely sure it was a promise she could keep. But as she stood there in her mother's arms, the key pressing against her leg through the fabric of her pocket, she knew there was no turning back now. Her father had left her a trail to follow, and she was going to see it through to the end, no matter where it led. Do you think Ellen was right to stay quiet all these years? Or should she have risked everything to expose Richard Hale? Drop a like if you think she should and a comment if you think otherwise. The industrial storage facility sat on the outskirts of the city where abandoned warehouses and rusted chain-link fences lined streets that hadn't seen fresh paint in decades, the kind of place people came to hide things they never wanted found again. Lucy arrived just after dawn, the key to Unit 247 burning a hole in her pocket while her heart hammered against her ribs with anticipation and dread in equal measure. She'd barely slept since leaving her mother's apartment, her mind replaying every revelation and every unanswered question until exhaustion finally pulled her under for a few restless hours. The facility manager barely looked up when she signed in, just handed her a clipboard and pointed toward the rows of storage units stretching into the distance like metal tombs. Unit 247 was tucked in the back corner, its orange door coated in dust thick enough to write in, and when Lucy turned the key in the padlock, it resisted for a moment before giving way with a rusty groan that echoed through the empty corridor. Inside, the air smelled stale and forgotten, like breathing in 20 years of secrets all at once. Boxes were stacked floor to ceiling along the walls, each one labeled in her father's neat handwriting: Research Notes 1998, Phoenix Prototypes, Financial Records, Patent Applications, and tucked in the corner sat old computer equipment covered in plastic sheeting that had yellowed with age. Lucy stood in the doorway for a long moment, overwhelmed by the physical evidence of her father's life before it was stolen from him, before Richard Hale turned something beautiful into something deadly. She started methodically, opening boxes and scanning their contents, finding technical diagrams that meant nothing to her untrained eyes and correspondence between her father and Richard that documented their partnership from its hopeful beginning to its bitter end. But what caught her attention was a small safe tucked behind a stack of prototype components, its combination lock waiting patiently for someone who knew the right numbers. Lucy tried several combinations: her birthday, her parents' anniversary, the date of the supposed factory fire, before she remembered what her mother once told her about how her father always said the day she was born was the best day of his life. She entered the digits slowly. April 15, 2000, and the safe clicked open with a sound that felt like destiny fulfilling itself. Inside lay 3 items that would change everything. A flash drive labeled Evidence, "Keep safe" in her father's handwriting sat on top of a sealed manila envelope addressed, "To whom it may concern," in bold letters, and beneath both was a thick stack of financial documents bound together with rubber bands that had long since lost their elasticity. Lucy's hands trembled as she gathered the items carefully, knowing without looking that these were the answers she'd been searching for, the proof her father had died protecting. What do you think Lucy should do next? Go to the press, confront Richard Hale, or find out what's on that drive first? Comment your theory. I'm reading every one. She called Daniel Chen from the parking lot, her voice shaking despite her attempts to sound calm. Daniel was an investigative journalist she'd met 2 years ago when he was researching corruption in city development projects, and they'd stayed friends even after his story won awards and her life remained stubbornly ordinary. "I found something," she said when he answered, "and I need your help looking at it before I lose my nerve." An hour later, Lucy sat in Daniel's cramped apartment while he connected the flash drive to his laptop, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock as files began loading onto the screen. "Lucy," he said quietly, his voice tight with barely contained excitement and horror, "do you know what you've got here?" "Tell me," she whispered, though part of her wanted to close her eyes and unhear whatever came next. Daniel clicked on the first video file, and suddenly the screen filled with grainy footage of a laboratory dated 20 years ago, the timestamp marking it as the night her father disappeared. Jack Lawson stood facing Richard Hale across a table covered in blueprints, and even through the poor quality recording, Lucy could see the anger radiating from both men like heat waves. "You sold us out," her father's voice rang clear through the speakers, sharp with betrayal. "Everything we built was supposed to help people, Richard. Affordable clean energy for communities that need it most, not weapons technology for the highest bidder." Richard's face on the screen looked younger but no less arrogant, his mouth twisted into a sneer that made Lucy's stomach turn. "You're naive, Jack," he shot back, his tone dripping with condescension. "The defense contract pays 10 times what our noble mission ever could, and I'm not going to apologize for choosing financial security over your idealistic fantasies." "Then I'm going public," Jack said, his voice steady and resolute. "I'm taking the original research, the patent applications with both our names, and every piece of documentation proving this technology was meant for civilian use, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you tried to do." The argument escalated quickly after that, voices rising and accusations flying until Richard grabbed Jack's arm and the two men struggled, their bodies moving out of frame while the camera continued recording audio. Then came the sound that made Lucy's blood run cold, a single gunshot, unnaturally loud in the confined space, followed by a horrible silence that stretched for several seconds. When Richard's voice finally broke through the quiet, it was panicked and desperate, all his arrogance stripped away by what he'd just done. "We need to make this look like an accident," he said to someone off camera, someone whose answering voice was too low to make out clearly. "Get everything ready. Factory fire, body recovered, investigation closed before anyone asks questions." Daniel stopped the video, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly as he turned to Lucy. "This is murder," he said simply. "This is Richard Hale confessing to murdering your father and covering it up. Lucy, this could bring him down." Lucy couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at the frozen image on the screen showing the empty laboratory where her father had died. She'd known the truth would be bad, but knowing and seeing were two entirely different things, and the grief that hit her felt fresh and raw like the wound had just been opened all over again. "We need to make copies," Daniel said, already pulling out external hard drives and cloud storage devices. "Multiple copies to multiple people. My editor, the district attorney, every media contact I trust, because once this goes public, Hale is going to come after you with everything he's got." Lucy nodded numbly, watching Daniel work while her mind struggled to process everything she'd just witnessed. But then something outside caught her attention, a black SUV parked across the street, the same vehicle she'd noticed following her from the storage facility, its dark windows hiding whoever sat inside watching and waiting. "Daniel," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "how long has that SUV been parked out there?" Daniel's head snapped up, and he immediately pulled up his security camera feed on a second monitor. The footage showed 2 men in dark suits standing near the building entrance, their postures alert and their eyes scanning every person who walked past. "Those are Hale's security team," Daniel confirmed, his jaw tightening. "I recognize them from the photos you showed me. We're being watched. Fear spiked through Lucy's chest, cold and sharp, but it was quickly replaced by determination that burned hotter than her terror. Then we move now, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Upload everything to your secure servers, send copies to everyone you trust, and let's get this evidence where it needs to go before they can stop us. Daniel's fingers flew across the keyboard, files uploading and email sending while Lucy gathered the physical documents and made her own calls to the district attorney's office and several news stations. They were racing against time now, racing against men with orders to keep secrets buried no matter the cost, and Lucy knew with absolute certainty that the next few hours would determine whether her father's death meant something or remained just another covered-up crime. "Ready?" Daniel asked, unplugging his laptop and shoving it into a backpack along with the flash drive and documents. "Ready," Lucy confirmed, though her heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear her own voice. They moved toward the door together, knowing that stepping outside meant stepping into danger but also knowing there was no other choice. Her father had left her this evidence for a reason, and she was going to make sure the world finally knew the truth about Richard Hale, no matter what it cost her. They slipped out the back exit of Daniel's apartment building, moving quickly through the narrow alley that connected to the street behind while the black SUV remained parked out front, its occupants still watching the main entrance. Lucy's pulse hammered in her ears as they jogged through the early morning streets, Daniel's backpack heavy with evidence that could destroy a billionaire's empire if they could just stay ahead long enough to deliver it. Behind them, she heard car doors slamming and voices shouting, and when she risked a glance back, two men in dark suits were rounding the corner at a run. "This way," Daniel gasped, pulling her toward a crowded subway entrance where commuters were already flooding into the station for their morning routines. They pushed through the turnstiles and merged with the crowd, using bodies as shields while Lucy's heart threatened to beat right out of her chest. When the train arrived, they squeezed into the packed car and watched through the window as Marcus and another security guard scanned the platform desperately, their faces twisted with frustration at having lost their targets. 3 stops later, they emerged in the downtown district where 24-hour businesses catered to night shift workers and insomniacs, and Daniel led them to a small internet cafe tucked between a laundromat and a convenience store. The owner barely looked up from his phone as they claimed a computer in the back corner, and Daniel immediately began uploading files to encrypted cloud servers while his fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "How long?" Lucy asked, watching the progress bars crawl across the screen with agonizing slowness. 10 minutes for the uploads, another 5 to send the encrypted packages to my contacts, Daniel said without looking away from his work. "We need to make sure this gets to enough people that Hale can't bury it even if he stops us." Lucy pulled out her phone and opened the camera app, her hands shaking as she positioned herself in front of the white wall. She hit record and took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of courage she had left. "My name is Lucy Beth," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "and my father, Jack Lawson, was murdered 20 years ago by Richard Hale to cover up the theft of their shared research. Everything I'm saying can be proven by the evidence that's being released today, and if anything happens to me, I want everyone to know that Richard Hale is responsible." She explained the whole story in 5 minutes. The partnership, the betrayal, the confrontation, the cover-up, and when she finished, she sent the video to her mother, to Daniel's editor, and to 3 different news stations. Whatever happened next, her father's story would survive, and that was all that mattered. "Done," Daniel announced, his relief palpable as the final file finished uploading. "Everything's distributed, my editor already confirmed receipt, and the district attorney's office is calling me back in." He stopped mid-sentence as Marcus appeared in the cafe doorway, flanked by 3 other security personnel whose cold eyes swept the room until they landed on Lucy and Daniel in the back corner. The owner suddenly became very interested in cleaning the counter, his survival instincts telling him to make himself invisible while whatever was about to happen played out. Lucy's mind raced through options that didn't exist, escape routes that were already blocked, and in that moment of clarity born from desperation, she pulled out her phone and dialed the number she'd found online. Richard Hale's private line, the one he gave to business associates and politicians. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Irritated and suspicious. "Who is this?" Richard demanded. "It's Lucy Beth," she said, her voice carrying across the silent cafe where everyone had stopped pretending not to watch. "And your security team is currently surrounding me in a cafe downtown, which is going to look really bad when the police arrive because the evidence of my father's murder is already distributed to every major news outlet and law enforcement agency in the state." The silence on the other end stretched for several heartbeats before Richard spoke again, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "You're making a mistake you can't take back," he said. "No," Lucy corrected him, surprised by how calm she sounded. "The mistake was yours 20 years ago when you killed my father instead of honoring your partnership. I'm just making sure everyone knows what you did, and I'm giving you one chance to face this with whatever dignity you have left." "What do you want?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse. "Meet me at the Sterling in 1 hour," Lucy said, thinking of the restaurant where this had all started, where she'd first seen her father's face on that portrait. "Bring your lawyers if you want, but Daniel's news crew will be there with cameras, and the police will be present as witnesses. You're going to answer for what you did, one way or another." She hung up before he could respond and looked at Marcus, who was clearly receiving instructions through his earpiece. After a moment, he nodded curtly and stepped aside, gesturing for his team to stand down. 1 hour, Marcus said, his voice flat. "Don't be late." 55 minutes later, Lucy stood in the main dining room of the Sterling wearing the same uniform she'd been fired in days ago, though now she stood as something other than an invisible server. Daniel's news crew had set up cameras discreetly around the room, and 2 police detectives from the district attorney's office waited at a corner table, their presence lending official weight to what was about to unfold. Her mother sat near the front, her face pale but her eyes fierce with pride and fear in equal measure. Richard Hale arrived exactly on time, flanked by 3 lawyers in expensive suits whose expressions suggested they already knew this was a battle they couldn't win. The millionaire looked older than he had days ago, his face haggard and his movements lacking their usual confidence, and when his eyes met Lucy's, she saw something that might have been resignation. "I'm here," he said simply. "What do you want from me?" Lucy stepped forward, very aware of the cameras capturing every word and gesture. "I want the truth," she said. "I want you to admit what you did to my father, why you did it, and how you covered it up for 20 years while my family lived with a lie." "I have no idea what you're talking about," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction, and his lawyers shifted uncomfortably. "Your father died in an industrial accident, tragic but not." "Stop," Lucy interrupted, pulling out her phone and connecting it to a portable speaker Daniel had set up. "Just stop lying, because everyone in this room and everyone watching the live stream is about to hear exactly what happened." She hit play, and her father's voice filled the restaurant. "You sold us out, everything we built was supposed to help people," followed by Richard's arrogant response and the escalating argument that ended in a gunshot and Richard's panicked confession. The audio played for 3 minutes that felt like hours, and when it finished, the silence was absolute. Richard's face had gone gray, and his hands trembled as he gripped the back of a chair for support. "I didn't mean," he started, then stopped, seeming to realize that intention didn't matter anymore. "It was an accident. The gun went off during the struggle, and I panicked. I had so much to lose, my reputation, my company, everything I'd built, and I made a choice." "You chose to let my father's death be meaningless," Lucy said, her voice breaking despite her attempts to stay strong. "You chose to steal his work, profit from his vision, and let a little girl grow up believing her father abandoned her. That's not an accident, Mr. Hale, that's 20 years of deliberate cruelty." The detective stood up, moving toward Richard with handcuffs already in hand, and his lawyers stepped back, their professional obligations ending where criminal prosecution began. As Marcus was taken into custody alongside his employer for conspiracy and obstruction of justice, Lucy felt her mother's arms wrap around her from behind, holding her steady while the weight of everything they'd carried finally began to lift. 6 weeks later, Lucy stood in the cemetery where her father had always belonged, though his body had never been recovered from whatever Richard Hale had done with it after the murder. The new headstone read, "Jack Lawson, engineer, visionary, beloved father. His truth lives on," and Lucy carefully placed the portrait photograph against the marble, the image of her father and Richard before everything went wrong. Fresh flowers surrounded the memorial, sent by people who'd read her father's story and wanted to honor his memory. The Phoenix system was being developed by an ethical energy company that promised to honor Jack's original vision of providing affordable clean power to underserved communities, and Lucy had been invited to join the board that would oversee its implementation. Richard Hale was facing murder charges, and though his lawyers were fighting hard, the evidence Daniel had distributed made conviction almost certain. "I did it, Dad," Lucy whispered, touching the cool stone. "I finished what you started, and everyone knows the truth now. I'm sorry it took me so long to find it." Her mother squeezed her hand gently, tears streaming down both their faces, and together they stood in the silence that felt more like peace than grief. Justice couldn't restore the 20 years they'd lost or bring back the man they'd both loved, but it could ensure his legacy survived and his vision lived on in the world he'd tried to make better. And standing there in the morning sunlight, Lucy knew that her father would have been proud of her for refusing to let his story end in darkness.
Thank you for watching the story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as can ever imagine. So, do check it out.